Hello and welcome to Rolling in Mills, and today we have Noah Baumbach's 2005 indie comedy quirky film The Squid and the Whale. Now, straight up out of the gate, I'm going to say that I think this film is really pretentious. And I like a lot of pretentious stuff. My taste is typically, if you look at the top 50 films that I like, they're really, really pretentious. But I think there's a fine line between good pretentious and bad pretentious. And it's one of those things where when you try to elevate your art to something more artistic or more experimental, you really get split down the middle pretty much between either failing horribly, and when you fail, you fall hard. And when you succeed, it's a true victory, and they're, the best films, these experimental films, in my mind at least. So it's that kind of double-edged sword of you take that risk, but it's a more drastic effect either way, as opposed to just making a really generic film, and if it's bad, it doesn't really matter because you weren't really ever trying that hard in the first place, or trying to do anything super duper creative. And of course, as you probably guess, I feel like The Squid and the Whale falls into the failing of being good pretentious. But the weird thing about that is that I really like Baumbach's other films. Frances Ha is great. It's fantastic. It's one of the better films of 2012, and Kicking and Screaming, while not absolutely incredible, is a really solid kind of coming of age film. And just to kind of reveal my bias on this, I'm not typically a fan of this kind of film, the kind of quirky indie family drama with all these kind of hyper accentuated characters. They kind of do all these crazy, very what I call art student things, but they're kind of meant to be regular people. I mean, there are some really good ones, yeah. I really like Frances Ha, and Frances Ha is basically that film personified. It's not like it can't be done well, but most of the time, not only do I find them pretentious, I just find that they're pretty poorly written, and all of them, in trying to be super quirky and indie, all fall into all the cliches that go with the genre of indie and quirky family drama thing. So for me, all of the dialogue blends together, and it's funny because there's kind of a line pertaining to that in Kicking and Screaming where you have this group of these quirky college art students, and then this kind of girl comes along and says, "Oh, you all talk the same." I'm not sure if that was meant to be a dig at how Baumbach kind of writes all of his characters sounding like the same person, but that's one of my criticisms of Squid and the Whale as well, and I don't think it was intentional there. And here, I really dislike this quirky style because I feel like it's actually really lazy. It's quite obvious that these films are self-inserts for Baumbach's life, particularly Kicking and Screaming. He kind of writes these semi-central main characters, though to be fair, both The Squid and the Whale and Kicking and Screaming don't really have very central protagonists. They're more ensemble cast, but it's the main character is so obviously him. They're all set in Manhattan, college-age students kind of coming of age, and while I think that the three films I'm referring to are distinctly different in their own ways, and I think Frances Ha is the most different and by far the best for that reason, it just feels lazy. And it's not as if self-insert things are inherently bad. Fucking Dante's Divine Comedy is literally about the author Dante going to hell with his all-time favorite poet Virgil, where he sees all of the people he didn't like in, contemporary Florentian politics, they're all burning in hell, and all the people he likes, they're all in purgatory or heaven. But here it feels like Baumbach is just writing himself as this very, very cool character through Jesse Eisenberg, and funnily enough, this was kind of his big debut thing. And I mean, he's okay. I think he does a decent job with the material he's given. He's only really stood out to me in The Social Network, but he just kind of plays autistic Mark Zuckerberg there, and I actually much prefer Andrew Garfield's performance in that film. But anyway, it's quite obvious that Eisenberg is trying to do the best with the material he's given. I don't think it's very good. As a whole, I just think the writing is weak and really try hard. And the thing is that Kicking and Screaming does this as well. It also has a kind of almost Fonzie-esque but artistic writing character, and he's, such a tortured artist, and he smokes, and it's all very literary, But he isn't significant enough a character in the film. He actually doesn't have an enormous presence, especially for a protagonist, and I feel like his actual personality, or Baumbach's personality, is criticized more in that film than it is in The Squid and the Whale. Eisenberg's character is kind of in the right for the most part during this film, and then just really at the end he has this weird change of heart that I thought was just really out of nowhere and kind of poorly written. So I mentioned that I really dislike the writing as a whole for this style of film, but in particular The Squid and the Whale, where I feel it has that Linklater-esque stoner, pseudo-science, pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-philosophical dialogue that's so poignant poignant, inverted commas, and it's so, telling of the human experience. And honestly, it does absolutely nothing new, and you're only exploring those themes through dialogue, and I feel like you're really limiting yourself there. Obviously, it's okay to talk about, vast, lofty themes and, metaphysics and all these interesting things, but I feel like they're just kind of shoved in here as a kind of show-offy method of being like, look how intelligent I am, look how intelligent my films are, look how intelligent my characters are, and look at the depth of conversation that they're having, and that's kind of like the definition of pseudo-intellectualism for me. And it's not only just not covering, the heart of the issue, or just pretending to know the heart of the issue, but it's showing off about it in the process. I'm sure Baumbach has a fine understanding of the topics he's talking about, but just the way he's kind of really showing off about it and really shoving it in your face is really indicative to me that he's purely doing that to show off and not as like a genuine exploration of his characters. And I think that also comes through in just, God, the amount of like name drops and literary references here, they're just really irritating. And I mean, he's name dropping books that aren't esoteric at all. They're fucking like entry level shit. Like the amount of times he fucking referenced Kafka here. Who hasn't heard of Kafka that's into art? Like, it's really not that secretive, dude. And not only do I find the dialogue and just as a whole the characters really irritating, but I think that the actual plot and structure of the film is just really poor. These films typically are quite plotless, and by that I mean they don't really have a very cemented structure. They're kind of wishy-washy, they're very scene to scene. They're much more about character arcs and character interactions and, how characters end up with each other and how they feel about each other, rather than a very distinct beginning, middle, and end plot. And I feel like that works really well for Frances Ha and pretty well for Kicking and Screaming, because those films are really about kind of directionless college-age students, in particular Frances Ha, which is very, very jumpy, and I really like that because it shows how disorganized Frances's life is. She's jumping around, she doesn't know what she's doing. You'll spend quite a bit of time in one place and then suddenly, it's 2 months later, and I really, really like that about the film. Same with Kicking and Screaming, it's all about these college-age students. They don't know whether they're doing another year. This one character doesn't know if he should go to Czechoslovakia, and it very much fits that style where it's jumping month forward, month forward, month forward, and there isn't really one very distinct central objective for the film. It's just a series of like mini objectives for the characters. And I feel like that works fine for those two films, but the issue is that The Squid and the Whale tries to have it both ways, where you have this pretty distinct plot of Jesse Eisenberg's parents, divorcing, and his brother, kind of siding with his mum a bit more, and Eisenberg siding a bit more with his dad. But then at the same time, he tries to do that kind of plotless thing where you have these random subplots or characterizations for characters that don't really go anywhere. Like, for example, there's just this really bizarre subplot with his younger brother who looks like he's about 8 or 9 but is apparently in high school, so I don't know how that works. Speaking of which, the ages for this whole film really confused me. Jesse Eisenberg I think was like 22 or 23 at the time of shooting this, but he's meant to be in high school, but he also might be in college. It's very confusing. But anyway, his younger brother starts drinking beer all the time, and then he's jacking off in front of the mirror, and then there's this bizarre sequence where he's smearing his cum all over the walls of his school and his library. It's what the fuck? And so I'm thinking, okay, this is, hey, I mean, whatever you want to do, you can do anything well, so sure, show me what you got. And then the film ends and it never resolves that subplot and it never talks about it. And I feel like if you're really trying to go for that, hey, we're just exploring life, it doesn't have to be part of the plot, man. You can't have it both ways where you're also having a really distinct plot. Things need to be resolved sometimes if you're going in that direction. You can't just be like, oh, this is what the plot's about, and then have these random side arcs that have literally nothing to do with anything in the rest of the film. Obviously, it's about his character being affected by the divorce and then kind of changing as a result of that, but the change doesn't have any sort of outcome or influence on the plot as far as I can remember, or if it is, it's so subtle that it does not justify the amount of time we spend on this. This is a significant portion of the film. It isn't 5 minutes or something. It's significant. What? I mentioned this in the Boyhood review, but I feel like if you're going to do something artsy and experimental, you gotta grab it by the balls. You gotta go all the way with it. And that was my criticism for Boyhood, was that it tries to do this crazy 12-year epic thing that hasn't really been done before. Totally not. And at the same time, it's shot and structured really generically and nothing really goes on. So that was my central reason for why I didn't think it worked. And the kind of combating point I made is that you have Southern Tango, Bela Tarr's film, that takes that kind of, hey, we're just showing life and it's meaningless, and we're making that 8 hours long, we're making the average shot length, really, really long, 3 minutes or something. And I feel like the same thing applies here, and it's something that Frances Ha does really well, where it really does, you know, take that artistic expression and really just runs with it. The direction is great in that film. The aesthetic is great. I love that it's in black and white. I love the way that it's shot. It has these really cool, like, straight up shooting, kind of like this sort of angle where it's straight on with characters and they'll do like 180-degree turns, and it's fantastic. And that basically means that I think that the aesthetic of the film, the visual style, and, you know, the sound design, they really work with the writing, with the plot, with the way the film's structured. Here, I mean, God, I'm gonna go into this a bit later. I think this film is just terribly shot and directed. There's some seriously, like, bizarre choices of, like, shot size, angle, shot sequences, just like that just scream that you don't know what you're doing film language-wise, which is super jarring coming from Francis Ha, yet again, that I think is shot really, really well. Now, I don't often really heavily go into the soundtracks of films, but I feel like I kind of have to mention this here because there is a distinct subplot in The Squid and the Whale about Jesse Eisenberg's character playing a musical piece, and that musical piece is referred to over and over and over again. And it's weird because I normally like Baumbach's soundtracks. I love the fact that in Kicking and Screaming he uses a Nick Drake track. Nick Drake, absolutely one of my favorite artists. I would highly recommend checking him out if you haven't heard his stuff. Pink Moon or Five Leaves Left are just amazing and great places to start. And at the same time, the Francis Ha soundtrack, while I can't recall any very distinct songs, was really great, and like I was saying, really contributed to the aesthetic of that film. But here the soundtrack, while not being like really amazing or terrible, just pretty average in comparison to his other stuff, there is the consistent use of the Pink Floyd song Hey You from The Wall. And as soon as it started playing, I'm like, oh wow, they got the rights to that. Jesus Christ, that must have been, you know, really expensive because it's a fucking Pink Floyd track from The fucking Wall. And I think I was right about that because they play this track honestly 3 or 4 times, separate times. You know, sometimes it's Jesse Eisenberg's character playing it on a guitar because there's this whole subplot, which is actually decent. I kind of liked it. It was probably one of my favorite parts of the film, where he's going for this talent show and basically he just copies the song Hey You and performs it word for word, but claims that he actually invented and wrote the song himself. But I mean, just because they bought the rights for it, they just overuse it over and over and over and over again. And I just have to kind of disagree with that on a creative standpoint. I think one of my kind of favorite anecdotes about film is when it comes to editing, apparently quite a few directors don't tell stories about the shoot to their editors. And so, for example, I honestly can't remember what this film is, but the circumstance was one of the final shots of this film was this very, very expensive crane shot. It cost like a quarter of the film's budget, and it was very, very long and showed just this incredible camera work. But when the director gave the film to the editor, he didn't tell him how much this shot cost, and so the editor comes back with the film, and he just had totally not used it because he felt like it didn't work for the ending scene. And in fact, the ending scene just worked much, much better with just this really simple, like, B-roll footage that wasn't even intended to be remotely near the ending. And so kind of the moral of the story is that just because you spent a lot of time doing it in production, and just because you put a lot of money into it, doesn't mean you have to use it in your film over and over and over again. The only importance it has is that it costs you a lot of money and it costs you a lot of time, but I mean, if it doesn't work for the final product, don't use it. And I feel like repeatedly using Hey You really just, I mean, it gets old. I love the song, I love The Wall, but I mean, hey, you just don't want to use it 4 times in the same film. You wouldn't really want to use any song 4 times in the same film. And as I mentioned, Jesse Eisenberg is trying to pawn off the fact that he wrote Hey You and, you know, he created this, and everyone, like, believes him immediately. And he performs this in front of his entire school and, like, wins this talent competition. But, like, how has no one heard of one of the most famous tracks from The Wall, which is one of the most famous prog rock albums of all time, only like 7 years after it was released as well, and only like 4 years after the film came out? How has no one who is of high school / college age ever heard of this track or called him out on it? And speaking of which, fuck you, Baumbach, having a fucking The Thing poster in Eisenberg's room. I mean, okay, like, Red Letter Media talk about this all the time, but The Thing was a flop when it came out. It did terribly. It's only been in relatively recent years that the film has gained, you know, massive popularity and acclaim. Fucking no one in 1986 would have fucking had a poster for The Thing. It just doesn't happen unless, of course, Eisenberg's character, which is a reflection of Baumbach, was so artistic that you could really see, you know, the truth in The Thing, which was released in 1982, which means his character would have been like 14 or 13 at the time it was done, so fuck you, don't know what you're talking about, motherfucker. Okay, so now on to the visual direction of this film, and honestly, I was blown away by how bad it was. It's honestly, like, stunning. It looks like a student film. It's just, Oh, I don't know. I don't know what he was trying to do. And it's weird because this style isn't replicated yet again in any of his other films. Like I was saying, Francis Ha looks really great. I really like the visual design of that film. Kicking and Screaming is not really worth a mention. It's just plainly shot. It's just shot like just an average film. But here, he just has these weird techniques that come out of nowhere. There's lots of cuts that are very jarring and just visual sequences that just don't work. They're just like not the shots you would choose, or not the angles you would choose, or not the way that you would cut them to create a normal sensation of motion and rhythm. It just doesn't work. Like, for example, there's this bizarre technique he uses multiple times, and honestly, it looks more like an error than an intentional choice, but at the same time, he uses it so many times that it has to be intentional, but I don't see what it adds. Basically, the camera starts off really, really shaky at the beginning of the shot, and then kind of zooms in and stops and holds in one place. Or alternatively, this happens at the end of a shot where, you're filming, the line ends, and then the camera just shakes a bit after that point before it cuts. And I don't know what you're trying to do artistically. It's really distracting and is constantly reminding us that we're watching a film, that someone is shooting this with a camera. I'm not sure if that was the intended effect. I don't think it has any thematic relevance to the rest of the film. Just like, what are you doing? I think I'm just going to show this sequence just plainly because I think it kind of speaks more for itself than I ever could. This is kind of the worst example of what I would call just very, very poor shot sequences. Just like shots that you wouldn't put together to tell a story or to tell like the motion that you're trying to do. And trying to nitpick or show examples for every single one of these would just be poor. It's the sensation that it's amateurish. In some student films, it's very, very obvious what they're doing wrong, and you're like, obviously they fucked that up. But here it's just a general sensation, and oftentimes I couldn't really put my finger on it. That wasn't the right shot. You didn't cut at the right time. You didn't move or position your actors correctly. And this happens so consistently that it just really drags down just my general sensation towards the film. It just feels so amateurish. And of course that's coupled with the crazy fucking shaky weird stuff. I just have no clue as to why he did that. It's honestly baffling to me. But yeah, here's the clip. Just kind of look at the shots he uses. They're just not correct. You might not have an enormous issue with that, but for me, it really sticks out. Like, why does it cut to that really weird Dutch super close-up angle and then it's outside the hospital and zooming in? It's like, what are you doing? Ultimately, this is a 52 out of 100 for me, and honestly, I just love the fact that this was nominated for an Oscar in writing. This is the cherry on top of the cake, And that's it. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you like this video, subscribe to this shit. Au revoir.